Hello, Cyclop presents the Clancy Litigation Group, Patrick Clancy and myself, Demosthenes Arandos, in another, the fourth seminar of our series, Defending Against False Allegations of Sexual Abuse. In this seminar, we're going to talk about junk science. What is junk science? Well, everybody has a different idea, but for our purposes today, two hallmarks of junk science are causism and hyperclaiming. What is causism? Causism means inferring a cause when no causal relationship actually exists. For example, it was widely once believed that when a little girl had erythema of the vestibule, sex abuse had happened. That's implying a cause, sex abuse, for the symptom erythema of the vestibule. Scientific research has shown that a majority of non-abused girls have erythema of the vestibule. Let's give another example, a simpler one. Person 1 is pregnant. An examination reveals person 1 is a woman. Person 2 is a woman, therefore she must be pregnant. Pretty silly, isn't it? That's junk science. That's causism. Causism implies a cause when no causal relationship necessarily exists. In our medical example, newer research demonstrates that claims such as erythema of the vestibule equals sexual abuse have been thoroughly researched, and the causistic or junk science underpinnings of some of those claims have been described in the scientific literature. What is hyperclaiming? Hyperclaiming is going too far with data. For example, probably one of the best examples of hyperclaiming is the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. Many years ago, around the time of the McMartin preschool nightmare, Roland Summit saw a number of children about whom allegations of sexual abuse had been made. In his setting, he noticed similarities. He noticed that the children he saw often seemed helpless. He noticed that the children he saw often seemed to retract allegations that they had made. He noticed a variety of symptoms in children he saw that we would expect in children who were anxious. Dr. Summit later wrote that his experience caused him to believe that if children exhibited these symptoms, sexual abuse had happened. He later denied that this was his intention. Nevertheless, he believed we can generalize from symptoms like helplessness and retraction that sexual abuse had happened. This was hyperclaiming. When behavioral scientists or mental health personnel generalize from too small a sample, it's hyperclaiming. Junk scientists gloss over or simply neglect to inform about the importance of numbers, namely lots and lots of people in a sample from which they want to generalize. Junk scientists gloss over or simply neglect to inform about base rates. They fail to inform that all of these kinds of symptoms or signs actually occur in the general population. Junk scientists often gloss over or simply neglect to inform about the difference between incidence and prevalence. This refusal to describe the basic scientific principles, or in many cases a lack of knowledge of scientific principles, are the hallmarks of the junk scientist. In our court cases, these folks are not here to help the trier of fact, they are there to make a claim. Remembering the Roland Summit example, we can see that the junk scientist gets an idea about what's happened and then works very hard to get data to support that idea. That's called confirmatory bias. Many refer to it as pursuing a single hypothesis. These agenda-driven folks tend to neglect or simply ignore data that does not contribute to their goal. They are simply driving down one road with blinders on. The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome is a classic example of junk science. All roads lead to the conclusion, he did it. Built on confirmatory bias and hyperclaiming and causism, it would be difficult to find a better example of junk science than the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. There's more information about junk science in a book that my co-author Dr. Campbell and I wrote for judges. It's called the Bench Book in the Behavioral Sciences. We spent a great deal of time trying to educate judges as to how to determine what is good science and what is bad science. Causism, hyperclaiming, and then if you want to get a little bit more in detail, validity and reliability. These are all important aspects of good science. There are many examples of junk science being used by the child advocacy movement. We're going to use the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome to demonstrate to you how to approach this type of evidence.
Over the last 2 decades, we have read transcripts of trials and watched how different lawyers have unsuccessfully struggled to handle child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Let me tell you of my own experience. About 15 years ago, I hired one of the most qualified expert witnesses in the country. He had been the chair of the Ethics Committee of the American Psychological Association. The Ethics Committee defines and enforces the standard of care for psychologists. His committee addressed issues of junk science in psychology. The prosecution called an MFCC. When the witness stated that she was going to tell the jury about the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, all of the jurors grabbed their notepads and pencils. It was obvious that they believed they were going to finally get the key to deciding the case. The prosecution witness even cried during her testimony. I looked over and saw 2 jurors with tears in their eyes. Next, my Top Gun expert testified. He testified about causism, hyperclaiming, validity, and reliability, and about the hallmarks of good science. He testified about the lack of scientific research supporting Dr. Roland Summit's child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. As a prior chemical engineer, I completely understood his testimony and its significance. The problem was the jury was not made up of 12 scientists. The jurors all appeared that they were going to sleep. The DA's approach in cross-examination was simple. Question: do children that have been molested sometimes retract? Yes. Question: do children that have been molested sometimes delay reporting? Yes. Question: do children that have been molested sometimes accommodate the adults that molest them? Answer: yes. And on through each element of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, this type of questioning went on. I debriefed the jury following the verdict. The juror's impression was that my expert was very smart and very scientific, but he had admitted to everything that Roland Summit had said. If it's true, why are you calling it junk science? Remarked one juror. Why are you making such a big deal about it? Asked another. What difference does it make? Remarked another juror. The defense had won the junk science battle, but the DA had won the war for the hearts and minds of the juror. After more than a decade of getting beat up by child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, I had a 15-second epiphany. I was working with an expert witness on attacking a police interview of a child witness. The officer was asking only questions that would prove that a molestation had occurred. The officer failed to ask any questions on the issue that the allegation might be false. Further, the officer ignored all statements by the minor that indicated that nothing had occurred. We were trying to figure out how to explain to the jury that it is not just leading questions that were suggestive. The entire interview was highly suggestive because it was a confirmatory bias interview. A confirmatory bias interview is dangerous because it is not an investigation for the truth. It begins with the belief that the truth is already known and only looks for data supporting that view. Child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a confirmatory bias model. The question was, could we show that in a visual presentation without relying on technical scientific jargon? Could we show with a visual presentation that a confirmatory bias model or advocacy model was highly dangerous? We wanted it as understandable for the juror with a 6th grade education as the juror with a PhD. The solution came fast once we defined the problem as a confirmatory bias model. We are going to demonstrate to you how you can approach the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome and demonstrate to a jury that it is a confirmatory bias model. We're going to use testimony from a trial where the expert witness was Dr. Anthony Urquiza. We have been up against Dr. Urquiza many times in Northern California. He was later the expert witness for the prosecution in the Michael Jackson case. We have paraphrased some of the answers to get rid of the ums and ahs and deleted some of the issues that are not needed for this demonstration. The transcript of Dr. Urquiza can be found on our website, and we will give you that information at the end of this presentation.
The first step in attacking the junk science known as child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is to anticipate how the prosecution expert will counterattack. The counterattack is always the same. They rely upon another area of junk science. The bogus claims that only 2 to 6% of the allegations of sexual molestation are false. There are two methods to counter the junk science nature of this bogus percentage of false allegations claim. First, we have developed a system for disproving that false assertion and to expose the junk science on which it is based. However, due to the length of this seminar, we'll save that method perhaps for another seminar. The second method is simple. We've developed a motion in limine to exclude opinion testimony on what percentage of allegations of sexual molestation are false. This motion in limine is based on the fact that the opinion is improper and irrelevant opinion testimony. We have won this motion every time we filed it up to this date. At the close of this presentation, we will show you where you can get our most up-to-date motions to exclude this kind of evidence.
Okay, we're ready to start. Let's start the demonstration by looking at the prosecution's direct testimony from a child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome expert witness. Dr. Randy Rand will play the role of Dr. Urquiza.
The people call Dr. Anthony Urquiza.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Please be seated, state your name, and spell your last name for the record.
Anthony Joseph Urquiza. Urquiza.
Good morning, Dr. Urquiza.
Good morning.
Can you tell the jury what you do for a living?
Sure. Actually, I have a couple of titles. I'm a psychologist licensed in the state of California. I'm a member of the social clinical faculty in the Department of Pediatrics at UC Davis Medical Center in Sacramento, California. And last title, I'm Director of Mental Health Services for a program called the CARE Center, which is a medical and mental health service program specifically for children who are sexually abused, physically abused, and neglected in their families.
Is that care center part of UC Davis?
It is a part of the Department of Pediatrics.
Would you describe what you do in your present occupation? What kinds of things you do?
A few things. As a psychologist, I have historically conducted therapy, done therapy. Again, my area of expertise is child abuse, so I've done therapy with children who have been abused. I stopped doing that probably about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I had seen several thousand children in therapy. I continue to do psychological evaluations of families and children. I conduct research as I'm faculty. That's part of the mission of the university, is to do research in some area. My area being child abuse is the area I do research, and have been doing research on child abuse for the past 20 years. And last, the last thing I do is teaching. I teach in conferences. I don't teach a classroom setting. I teach, we have an internship program where we teach people to be social workers and psychologists. I teach at seminars, workshops, training that we do. And then the very last one is some administration where, as director, I have responsibility to manage some budget, personnel, those types of things.
Okay. Would you describe your educational background, including any internships you've done?
Sure. I have 3 degrees, all of them from the University of Washington in Seattle. I have an undergraduate degree in child development. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology and doctorate degree in psychology, or PhD in psychology.
And would you tell the jury what internships you've been a part of or that you've completed?
As a part of the education in the United States, to be a psychologist and to be licensed, you have to have an internship. I had an internship that was approved by the American Psychological Association at Primary Children's Medical Center which is in Salt Lake City, Utah, probably 1987, 1988, about that time.
Okay, can you describe for the jury specifically what teaching experience you've held?
Sure. Well, the beginning teaching experience I had was as a preschool teacher back in the 70s. I was a preschool teacher for a couple of years. As a graduate student at the University of Washington, I taught several classes related to child development and child abuse and problems, emotional and psychological problems that children and families have. I held for about a year and a half a teaching position or faculty position at the San Diego State University in the Department of Family Studies. And then I assumed my current position as faculty in pediatrics in January of 1990, so about 13, 14 years.
Okay, would you describe your training and experience as it relates to any expertise in the field of child sexual abuse and/or child sexual assault accommodation syndrome?
I entered graduate school with the expectation that my career decision was going to be as faculty, someone who taught, did research, and had a clinical expertise in child abuse. So I started graduate school in 1983, and so all of my training really has been specifically geared to that. So through graduate school, I was very focused on seeing clients who had a history of abuse and research and teaching. Since graduate school, since I received my degree, I regularly participate in conferences and trainings, and at my level now, I often give trainings at conferences. So I often present at workshops and conferences nationally, and I'm usually in a position to teach courses. I do that on a regular basis. The typical pattern for me is to attend a conference. Usually it's one I'm presenting at, and while I'm there I go to workshops and training for my own continuing education.
Can you describe any clinical or research experience that you have?
Clinical experience, I started seeing clients in 1983 when undergraduate school, at that time under somebody else's supervision. Now, as a licensed psychologist, I don't need that supervision. And so from about 1988, while I received my license in 1990, so 1990 until currently, I've been seeing children in either therapy or evaluations on a regular basis. I now supervise both faculty, I supervise both psychologists and social workers. I supervise psychology interns, and also supervise 6 supervisors. We have a staff of about 50 people, and I have 6 clinical supervisors, so I'm their direct supervisor. So a lot of my clinical responsibilities currently are involving supervision rather than providing direct services. With regard to research experience, again, that started in 1983. My areas of research have been primarily related to what are the effects of child abuse, either sexual abuse or physical abuse, on a child, and secondarily, what are the strategies that we can adopt to ameliorate or alleviate a lot of the problems kids have. What happens with the kids psychologically, or who's been abused, and probably over the last 8 years, what can we do to return them to as best mental health state as we can. So to alleviate mental health states they have incurred as a result of their abuses.
Can you tell the jury if you've authored papers related to the subject matter or closely related?
Yes, I have.
Can you give us a ballpark? How many or what topics have you covered?
Articles that have been published, I don't really keep track. I'd estimate maybe 35 or so of presentations, probably a few hundred presentations at conferences or workshops over the last 20 years.
Can you give me a little insight into what kinds of groups you've presented to over the years?
Sure. The American Psychological Association, the American Society on the Abuse of Children, the California Department of Education, numerous community child abuse prevention organizations, or national child abuse prevention organizations. There's an international society on the abuse of children. I've presented for them in several countries. The National Institute of Mental Health, the Center for Disease Control, the National Science Foundation. There's a few others, but those are some of the primary organizations that I've presented to.
Okay. Have you had occasion to produce any types of professional videos?
Yes, I have.
And can you tell me a little bit about that?
Again, I think I said earlier that probably around 8 years ago, I started shifting from what are the effects of abuse to how can we treat children who have been abused. And there's part of that developed and adapted a child treatment program, and currently involved in disseminating, training other organizations how to use that program, and concurrent with that has been the development of about 5 training videos. I say about because we're still working on one. Currently, I think there are 3 that are English, 2 in Spanish, and we're just finishing up the 3rd one in Spanish.
And can you describe for the jury any honors you've received?
I've received honors for work that I've done related to child abuse from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. I used to be one of the board of directors and now advisory board from the Department of Education for the Danforth Compton Fellowship. It's a national program related to ethnic minorities who achieve academic excellence and a few others.
And have you had occasion to receive various grants?
Grants, I have.
Can you give me an estimate of the total dollar amount of grants that you've obtained?
I don't think I can do that other than it's a few $1 million, but I couldn't tell you exactly how much.
Okay. Do you serve on any advisory boards?
I do.
Can you just name a few?
APSAC, American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, California Department of Social Services, California Department of Social Services related specifically to adoptions. I'm currently in Sacramento County on the advisory board for the Department of Mental Health, Sacramento County Department of Mental Health, and also the Victims Compensation Program, which essentially oversees a large amount of mental health services throughout the state of California, providing funds for children who have a history of being abused and neglected.
Can you describe any affiliations that you hold, professional affiliations?
APSAC, there are a few others. The international version of, not APSAC, but there's a CAPSAC, which is the state version of APSAC. There's the International Child Abuse Organization, and again, a couple of others, but I don't have a copy of my CV in front of me, so my memory might not be complete.
Okay, are you familiar with a theory called Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome?
I am.
Can you describe how it's that you're familiar with that concept?
My recollection is that I read that article when it was first published in 1983. The purpose of that article is to provide a description of what commonly occurs with a child who has been sexually abused. So since that time, I've been involved in training related to teaching people about what happens with kids who've been sexually abused, and a lot of the foundational research that has gone into support the child abuse accommodation syndrome. I currently teach psychology interns and social work interns about sexual abuse by explaining child abuse accommodation syndrome.
And in the 1,000 or so kids that you've personally treated, have you had occasion to utilize the theories of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes, I have. The child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is really developed to educate people, to inform them about what happens, and so I think that information that is contained within the accommodation syndrome has been very helpful to me, and something certainly I've seen repeatedly in children I've evaluated or treated. It is foundational to my understanding about what happens to kids who've been sexually abused.
Have you ever qualified in court in the state of California as an expert in the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
I have.
And how many times have you so qualified?
Maybe 80, 85 times would be my estimate, including in the Michael Jackson case.
And have you ever qualified as an expert in child sexual abuse?
Yes. I've testified a few hundred times in juvenile court where I've been asked by the judge to address a specific issue, often to evaluate either a child or an adult, and then to report back to the court.
Your Honor, I'd offer Dr. Urquiza as an expert in child abuse accommodation syndrome and child sexual abuse.
He's accepted as an expert.
Dr. Urquiza, what is CSAAS?
That phrase comes from the title in an article by Dr. Summit. The purpose of that article was to specifically, for people who would be doing therapy with children who had been sexually abused, and the purpose was to educate them, to dispel any misunderstandings or distortions or misperceptions that they had about what commonly occurred with a child who had been sexually abused, and to provide them with a framework to understand what the research said about what happened with sexual abuse. It's still being used for that same purpose.
Can you talk about some of the myths or understandings that it's directed towards dispelling?
Yes. One of the myths was, we know that very few children are sexually abused by a stranger. Sometimes it happens, but most children are sexually abused by someone with whom they have an ongoing relationship with. One of the misperceptions, if a child is sexually abused, she'll run and tell mommy, daddy, teacher. Again, we know from research, sometimes it happens, but it is much more typical for there to be some strategy placed upon the child to be quiet, sometimes throughout their whole childhood. Sometimes kids sexually abused don't disclose until adulthood.
Are there any myths associated with how a child presents in effect when they disclose sexual abuse?
The common expectation is that if you're going to talk or disclose being sexually abused, you will be crying, distraught. In fact, there appears to be a lot of evidence to support the fact that kids accommodate or get used to the experience of being sexually abused. I don't want to say they become normalized, but they're not as traumatized, or those feelings aren't as acute. As a result, when they make the disclosure, it's usual for kids to make it in a somewhat matter-of-fact or detached way. They don't look acutely distraught and crying. Clearly, there are kids who disclose and are distressed. I think what Dr. Summit is trying to present is that he's trying to present that child who makes that disclosure, and they're not crying and they're not upset. It's not atypical.
Let's talk a little bit about the theories that Dr. Summit announced in his paper. Is the first called secrecy?
Yes.
And would you describe for the jury what Dr. Summit meant when he talked about the concept of secrecy in his paper?
In order to understand secrecy, it's important to understand the context in which sexual abuse happens. It occurs in a relationship. Usually children are sexually abused by somebody they know. That's important because children tell us there's been some strategy imposed upon them to keep them quiet about the abuse, hence the term secrecy. So the strategy can be lots of different things. It can be an overt threat. It can be, if you tell, then you'll go to jail, or I'll kill you, or I'll kill your mom or dad or you. Dr. Summit says in his uses an example, you'll go to an orphanage, your parents will get divorced. Some type of coercive strategy imposed upon the child to keep them quiet about the victimization.
Did Dr. Summit discuss things that are other than direct threats?
Kids also tell us that they are bribed and provided special gifts. Doesn't necessarily have to be an overt threat. What I often explain to parents and children who come into therapy is clearly, if a child is being threatened, then a smart thing to do, if you're that child, would be to comply if the person who's threatening is bigger and stronger. But sometimes it can be a covert threat. If you see somebody beat up your mom and that person comes into your bedroom at night and wants to do something, then you should comply. Kids often feel like they could get in trouble if they were to disclose, and it's a topic that's not easy to talk about. Kids keep the secret about kids being abused because they're embarrassed, disgusted, or ashamed of what they participated in.
And is the next theory called helplessness?
Yes.
Would you describe for the jury what Dr. Summit meant when he talked about helplessness?
Sure. Essentially, the misperception is if you're a child and somebody approaches you with some overture to sexual abuse, you'll be able to do something about it, protect yourself, fend them off, prevent yourself from being sexually abused. Well, Dr. Summit points out the fact that that's not reasonable. In the face of a perpetrator who was bigger, stronger, smarter, more worldly, has more experiences, a child's not able to ensure their own sexual safety. They're not able to do anything to protect themselves. So Dr. Summit talks about the fact they're relatively helpless or vulnerable and relatively powerless.
Does Dr. Summit discuss kids being less able to protect their sexual safety?
Yes. Kids are relatively powerless when there's somebody who's in a position of authority or somebody bigger, stronger, and they are subordinate or submissive or weaker position than that person.
Does Dr. Summit talk about the causes of helplessness in the context of a known assailant or unknown assailant?
There's a context to the abusive relationship. Children abused by somebody with whom they have an ongoing relationship, and that person is bigger and stronger and inherently has more control over their life. If those two things are happening, acquaintance means there's ongoing contact, and the person is bigger, stronger, more authoritarian. That really serves to reinforce the strategies that are imposed upon kids. That is, if you're threatened to be quiet and you have ongoing contact with somebody who is both bigger, stronger, more powerful, and who has access to you, then that reinforces the notion that it is a really good idea for you to be quiet about the abuse.
Does Dr. Summit talk about abuse takes place in the context of a loving relationship, whether that makes the child even more vulnerable?
That would be a situation where a child would be perhaps most helpless, because if the perpetrator is somebody who's bigger, stronger, and in their family, then they have a fair amount of control over what the child does or says, or to be able to reinforce any type of threat that was made. And so even though the child may care about or may even love the person with whom they're being abused, that doesn't negate the accommodation syndrome. It's not uncommon for kids to love the person that's abusing them and to be sexually abused by that person.
Is there anything discussed in Dr. Summit's article about whether helplessness is exaggerated or increased when the caretaker is someone who has a substance abuse problem?
We know from the research that children who have a caregiver who is in some way incapacitated are at greater risk to be sexually abused. An example I often use is a mother who's an alcoholic may do a relatively poor job of supervising the child, may fraternize with people who have problems or are somewhat unseemly. So the child would have more contact with someone like that. And so if there is some incapacity in the ability of the caregiving environment, like a mom or dad or babysitter, that would put the child at greater risk, make the child more vulnerable or more helpless.
Is there another topic in Dr. Summit's paper called entrapment in accommodation?
There are 5 parts to the accommodation syndrome. The third one is entrapment and accommodation.
Would you describe for the jury what Dr. Summit meant by that?
Entrapment and accommodation. The entrapment part is pretty simple. If the child is sexually abused and can't do anything to stop it, that's helplessness and can't tell anybody. That's the secrecy. They're trapped. Summit goes on to talk about how a child copes with or adjusts with or deals with experiences that they are forced to endure. He goes on to speak about some of the coping strategies that kids go through to be able to manage the unpleasant feelings that he experiences as a result of being abused.
Can you describe that a little bit more?
One of the things that happens with kids when they're sexually abused, there are a lot of unpleasant feelings like being ashamed, a sense of humiliation or disgust, sometimes fear, sometimes even confusion. Not being old enough or appreciating what's happening to them. These are difficult feelings for them to experience and to tolerate. And we're finding in the mental health field for kids who are sexually abused, especially kids who are sexually abused at least a few times, they become somewhat numbed to those feelings because it's too difficult to tolerate. We've seen that in other types of people who experience trauma or traumatic events, and the most common, frequent one is veterans, where they have a numbing of the feelings that they have relating to the experiences that were too difficult for them to bear at the time. Even 20 years later, they still have some numbing. And so this process of accommodation really is this experience of trying to maybe compartmentalize a lot of the feelings that they have about the victimization experiences.
You talked a little bit about the concept of entrapment. Is it a myth that a child who's being sexually abused would not want to go back and see the person who's abusing them?
I think it's something that is not easily understood by people. If you're being sexually abused, why would you go back over their house? Why would you want to spend time? Why would you appear to enjoy time with that person? It's common for kids to have a relationship outside of victimization with the perpetrator. And as a result, it's common for kids to like that person who's abusing them, especially if that person is somebody who they care about, spend time with, do fun things with. Sometimes, if you're being sexually abused by mother, father, or big brother, it's common for kids to love that person because they need to love caregivers. That's what we do in families.
And is there a fourth theory from which Dr. Summit called delayed, unconvincing disclosure?
There is.
Would you describe what Dr. Summit meant by that concept?
Sure. Delayed disclosure is quite simple. That if the misperception is that if you are sexually abused, you'll tell somebody right away. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes kids are approached they're sexually abused and immediately go and tell somebody. That actually happens just a minority of times. The research shows that it's quite common for kids to have a delay in time from when they are first sexually abused to when they disclose that they have been sexually abused. What that means is a couple of things. The strategy that was imposed upon them to keep it a secret must be pretty effective if they can keep kids quiet about their sexual abuse for a significant period of time. So the idea that kids will tell right away is really not a common thing. It's really uncommon that kids tell right away. The third part of the accommodation syndrome is delayed and unconvincing disclosure. The best way to describe this is to think of sexual abuse as a process that is really hard to talk about. Victimization is difficult, and if you are a child who perhaps was threatened or perhaps felt embarrassed or humiliated about the experiences you participated in, it's really hard to put yourself in a position to tell somebody about that. And so what we found is that kids who go through this process of disclosure are often somewhat vague in providing some information. If they responded to positively or supportively, they may say more, and at times go on. They may tell more about their victimization experience over different iterations. They also may make some minor mistakes about disclosure. If you have somebody that says 5 or 4 different times, they're not exactly alike every single time. Then they may look unconvincing. That is, Dr. Summit was talking about the fact that this process, which we now have research to support, this process of disclosure may ultimately look like the child was not telling the truth or was unconvincing in their description of what happened to them because their disclosures are not identical every single time.
Is the concept of consistency taken into consideration in that disclosure process by Dr. Summit?
I think that's part of the process. The child may not be completely consistent, may not be able to articulate clearly the first time what happened. It may take a couple of times before a child is able to provide some kind of description about what happened to them in their victimization.
What studies, if any, were relied upon with regard to the proposition that a child might not disclose immediately about sexual abuse?
Well, there are actually about 4 or 5 studies. The one that I usually use is by Elliott Breyer, or Breyer-Elliott. They found basically about 3/4 of kids failed to disclose the first 12 months from when they were abused. We shouldn't expect that kids will disclose right away, although some kids do. Some kids have some significant delay by the time they're able to disclose.
And is it also fair to say some kids never disclose?
That's a reasonable assumption to make. In research that I've done with adults, there were a fair number of adults who never disclosed in their childhood. So if you were to say there are children who never disclose, understanding who never disclose, understanding that when they hit 18, they're no longer children. I would agree with that. There may well be and probably are people who never disclose throughout their entire lifetime.
And the last theory that Dr. Summit talks about, something called retraction.
Yes.
Would you briefly talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Again, we're talking about children who've been sexually abused and and what we found was that there are a small percentage of children who have been sexually abused who made a disclosure, who then took back the allegation of abuse. Summit goes on to talk about some of the reasons why a child who was abused would take back the allegation. He essentially points to the child having access to the perpetrator. Presumably, the perpetrator reinforces the threats or coercion, so the child keeps quiet. Sometimes other things like pressures put on by the family about the abuse for a variety of reasons results in the child retracting allegations of abuse.
Okay, did Dr. Summit write a second article about 9-10 years later called Abuse of the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation?
Yes, it was either 1990 or 92, somewhere around there.
And what was the premise of the second article?
He felt that at that time that there was some misuse of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. He felt people were using the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome as a way to diagnose child abuse. If you have these 5 things, then you're sexually abused. And he was arguing that that would be an improper use of the child abuse accommodation syndrome, because it's not the place of mental health professionals to say whether a particular person is a perpetrator or not, or a particular child has been sexually abused. That's a criminal issue and a jury issue. So he was arguing if anybody is using it for that purpose, it's inappropriate. This is not a diagnosis. It's really an educational tool to explain what happens with sexual abuse. The other thing that he was trying to explain is that there's a lot of discussion about what the definition of a syndrome is, because it is called child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. People often equate syndrome with diagnosis or medical condition, and there's been a lot of arguments or discussion about whether child abuse accommodation syndrome is really a syndrome or not. I actually think it is, in my opinion, but his position is that he wishes we would not use the term syndrome because it detracts from the overall idea, which is just to explain what happens with kids who have been sexually abused. He says in the follow-up it would have been probably better if he called it child sexual abuse accommodation pattern, because that would have avoided the controversy with the term syndrome.
So the premise of the second article was to suggest that perhaps syndrome wasn't an appropriate word to use? That pattern is the word he would have rather used?
Correct.
And that CSAAS is not something to be used for purposes of diagnosing or saying whether a child has in fact been abused?
Correct.
It is instead a tool used to dispel myths and to look at some things that typically might be associated with behaviors of the child sexual abuse victim?
I think that was its initial purpose, to dispel myths and misperceptions for therapists. I think in its current use in the courts, its use is to essentially do the same thing, to dispel myths or misunderstandings that the jury may have about sexual abuse.
During the course of your personal work with about 1,000 or so kids, have you specifically worked with kids who were victims of sexual abuse?
I have.
And were those sort of victims that you could ascertain as to known victims of sexual abuse, if you will?
For the most part, yes.
And in working with that large number of children over the years, have you been able to personally observe some of the theories that you're announcing in Dr. Summit's papers?
For clinical purposes, I think Dr. Summit's article has done a very good job of initially providing me with an understanding or a foundation of what happens with sexual abuse. And so I use that for that purpose, and now I use it for training also. I also use it to try to explain to parents who come in with their child with questions like, why didn't they tell me sooner? Or how could this have happened to my child? So it provides me with the framework to try to explain to parents about some of the dynamics that occur with sexual abuse and why it is that a child would have difficulty describing or disclosing victimization.
And in treating 1,000 or so kids, have you formed a personal opinion about whether you agree with the theories that Dr. Summit has put forward?
I have.
And what is your opinion?
It's consistent with what I see in children who have been abused. I think probably more importantly, my opinion is that the research supports the concept of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome by Dr. Summit.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
You've now had an opportunity to see what you're facing when a child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome expert testifies. We can assure you that if not countered properly, this testimony has a profound impact on the jury. Remember, at the close of the trial, the jury has read in a jury instruction, like, for example, Cal Jury Instruction 10.64, which states, "Evidence has been presented to you concerning child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. This evidence is not received and must not be considered by you as proof that the alleged victim's molestation claim is true. Child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome research is based upon an approach that is completely different from that which you must take to this case. The syndrome research begins with the assumption that a molestation has occurred and seeks to describe and explain common reactions of children to that experience. As distinguished from that research approach, you are to presume the defendant innocent. The people have the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You should consider the evidence concerning the syndrome and its effects only for the limited purpose of showing, if it does, that the alleged victim's reactions, as demonstrated by the evidence, are not inconsistent with her having been molested." What do you think goes through a juror's mind when she hears 1 or 2 hours of testimony about a syndrome? What do you think goes through the mind of a juror when he hears that this is a, quote, pattern of reactions, unquote, that children who have been molested demonstrate? Do you think they understand you should consider the evidence concerning the syndrome and its effect only for the limited purpose of showing, if it does, that the alleged victim's reactions as demonstrated by the evidence are not inconsistent with her having been molested? Who wrote this gibberish anyway? We have debriefed many juries, and the fact of the matter is that jurors don't get the jury instruction. Instead, they are swept away in the emotion of the prosecution's expert testimony. The jurors used the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome to find that molestation did in fact occur. That is the danger of junk science. We have developed a set of visual aids to teach the jury that child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is not only junk science, but it's dangerous. By the end of the trial, we want the jury to associate the concept child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome with bias as a one-sided, unfair, dangerous attempt to mislead them. In other words, we want the prosecution to wish they'd never introduced this piece of junk science.
Dr. Lorandos is one of the leading experts in the nation on junk science. He's written numerous articles and books on the subject. He's written a judge's bench book entitled Bench Book in the Behavioral Sciences, which is published by Carolina Academic Press. The thrust of the book is to explain what junk science looks like in the mental health arena and how to correctly apply Daubert and Kelly Fry. The problem is that in People versus Bledsoe, 1984, 36 Cal 3rd, 236, the California Supreme Court held that the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome does not have to comply with either Daubert or Kelly or Fry. If Dr. Lorandos was to testify for you, or someone with his credentials, you might want to consider a two-pronged attack on child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Prong 1. The jury could be taught the concepts of causism, hyperclaiming, incidence, prevalence, validity, reliability, and statistics, such as standard deviations. This would be a scientific approach to counter child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Prong 2, the jury is presented with a visual demonstration with minimal reliance on scientific jargon. They are taught the concepts not in the abstract, but in a visual manner. If you don't have a Lorandos as your expert to testify on your behalf, this second prong alone will do. To conduct the cross-examination, you will need to create a series of model boards with Mylar overlays. I have one here. This is an example of one of the 5. You will see them used during the demonstration later in this seminar. This is what I mean by the Mylar. It allows for visual presentation. You will also need to create a series of child sexual abuse accommodation quotes, also on display boards. Here's an example of one of the ones you will see later. This can be done with Microsoft Publisher files that you can use to create these display boards. I recommend that they be approximately 30 inches by 24 inches. The large model boards will not be used for cross-examination of the prosecution's witness. They will be saved for the defense expert. An artist's portable display case can be used to help you carry the boards. I found these cases at Aaron Brothers Art Mart, but most art supply stores carry them. There is a trial strategy that we recommend. You're going to be confronting the prosecution expert with quotes from Roland Summit's article, The Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. The expert will not be able to find the quotes, and he will be fumbling around. So what I recommend is that to prevent the presentation from bogging down and to make it snappy, that you present a copy of the article to the prosecution's expert to use and have all of the quotes in boxes so that they can be easy to find while on the stand. A copy of the article with the red boxes around the important quotes can be obtained in Adobe PDF file from the website we will provide you at the end of this seminar. The model boards can be modified to address the issues in your case. For example, they might be modified based upon whether your case involves a parent that is being accused during a divorce case, or if the client is a non-parent that is being accused. The charts are designed to show the jury that child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a confirmatory bias model, and to teach them why such a model is dangerous. If you have a large color printer, you can make changes with each case. If you don't have a large formatted color printer, I recommend that you take your Microsoft Publisher file to Kinko's. They have the printers and their computers accept Microsoft Publisher. You will also need a second set of the model boards, but this time 8.5 by 11 inches in size. During the cross-examination of the prosecution expert witness, you will use the small 8.5 by 11 model boards to guide your questioning of the prosecution expert. The prosecution expert will not see the large model boards. They are being saved for your expert's presentation. A copy of the 8.5 by 11 inch model boards will be provided to you on the website. We will tell you more about it at the end of this seminar. The idea will be to get the prosecution's expert to agree to as many details from your display boards as possible and to keep him from going off track into false claims about percentages. In this way, the prosecution expert is being used to set the stage for your expert's testimony. Here is how it goes. I will be playing the role of myself. One of our colleagues will be playing the role of Dr. Urqueza. Good morning, Dr. Urqueza.
Good morning.
We've met before?
Yes.
Do you do interviews of children where abuse is suspected?
Not usually. Usually the children that we see, some method has been used to determine whether the child has been abused already.
Do you, at the request of the district attorney's office or the police, conduct interviews of children where abuse is suspected and then turn your results over to the police, say?
No, that's not something I do.
Have you done that in the last 5 years?
No, it's not something I do. I don't do evidentiary interviews or evaluations whether abuse has occurred.
So you don't do evaluation interviews to determine if abuse has occurred, correct?
Correct.
How many times have you testified concerning child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
I would estimate 75 to 85 times would be a rough estimate.
Would those be in criminal cases?
Those would be criminal cases.
And would you normally be testifying for the prosecution?
Most of the time, yes.
Have you ever testified for the defense?
I have.
And approximately how many times?
About 3 times.
Now, when one does an evaluation, isn't it important that an evaluator be unbiased?
Yeah, usually yes.
Is it important for you to not be an advocate for one side or the other, but really to do a fair evaluation?
Those are not mutually exclusive. I think it's important to be unbiased. I think of myself as an advocate for the child and family. One of the things that I think I advocate for most strongly is a healthy relationship and a safe relationship. But within that context, certainly I usually advocate, as I believe, that children should be raised by their parents in a healthy way.
What is a confirmatory bias model?
Confirmatory bias model, it's more of a statistical term, really meaning bias or error that may be a result from someone having a predisposed opinion about the outcome. So if you have a preliminary opinion about an outcome going into something, you may be more likely to find that than if you had a completely neutral opinion.
Is that sometimes referred to as a single hypothesis model?
It could be.
And well, do you have a copy of the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome?
I do not.
Okay. Well, we have made one for you.
This is your copy?
Taking a look at the document that's been given to you, is that a copy of the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome?
Yes. A copy of the article that Dr. Summit wrote in 1983? Yes.
I would like to go through some of the quotations that are contained in that article. I have blown up these quotes and put them on boards. And I would like to go through the first board and read the first quote. Acceptance and validation are crucial to the psychological survival of the victim. Close quote. Is that a quote from the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome?
Yes.
Validation means letting the child know that they're being heard, correct?
I think that's a reasonable explanation of validation in this context, that they're being heard, being understood, being supported.
So Summit is promoting acceptance and validation, right?
I would agree with that, yes.
Well, let's go to the second quote. Quote, the validation of the child's perception of reality, acceptance by adult caregivers, and even the emotional survival of the child may also depend upon the knowledge and skill of the clinical advocate. Close quote.
Right.
So here he's talking about a clinical advocate, not an evaluator.
He's talking about somebody who would be supportive and advocating for the child.
He's talking about individuals coming in and testifying and advocating for the child, right?
I'm not sure that he's necessarily talking about that. If you remember my prior testimony, we have an assumption that the child has been sexually abused because the Child Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. So what we're talking about is advocating for a child who's been sexually abused. Not presuming that maybe the child has been or hasn't been. We're providing advocacy for a child who's been sexually abused.
So Summit starts with the position that the child he is talking about in the article has in fact been sexually abused?
That's the assumption, and then he describes what commonly occurs.
Let's go to the next quote. Quote, clinical experience and the expert testimony can provide advocacy for the child. That's a quote from the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And again, he refers to providing advocacy, correct?
Correct.
Next quote, is that accurate? Quote, they need an adult clinical advocate to translate the child's words into an adult acceptable language, close quote.
That's from Dr. Summit's article.
And again, he's talking about an advocate, correct?
An advocate for a child who's been sexually abused, yes.
Well, let's go to the next quote. Is this an accurate quote? Without a consistent therapeutic affirmation of innocence, the victim tends to become filled with self-condemnation and self-hatred for somehow inviting or allowing the sexual assault, close quote. So you have to keep supporting the child in their story so they don't feel that it's their fault.
Correct. That you would support the victim so they don't feel it's their fault.
Well, let's go to the next one. Quote, as an advocate for the child, both in therapy and in court, it's necessary to recognize, no matter what the circumstances, the child had no choice but to submit quietly and keep the secret, close quote. That's an accurate quote from the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, isn't it?
That's correct.
And he's talking about advocating, not just in therapy, but in court, correct?
Correct.
Well, let's go down to the next one. The more illogical and incredible the initiating scene might seem to adults, the more likely it is that the child's plaintiff description is valid. Is that an accurate quote, isn't it?
That's correct.
So, if what the child says is illogical and incredible, it's more likely that it's valid?
Well, that's what his statement is. That's what it says.
Well, he's advocating that no matter what the child says, you're supposed to believe it, isn't he?
What we're talking about is a child who's been sexually abused, and sometimes situations arise where the circumstances of their victimization may not seem logical or may not seem critical. And so I believe what Dr. Summit is saying, even in those situations where they're illogical or incredible, for a child who's been sexually abused, he thinks it's important to recognize the validity of their experience.
Well, let's look at the next quote. Unless there's an expert advocate for the child in the criminal court, the child is likely to be abandoned as the helpless custodian of a self-incriminating secret which no responsible adult can believe. Isn't Dr. Summit asking the reader to be an advocate in the courtroom?
Right?
Let's look at the next quote. Quote, the psychiatrist or other counseling specialist has a crucial, critical role in early detection, treatment, intervention, and expert courtroom advocacy. The specialist must help mobilize skeptical caregivers into a position of belief, acceptance, support, and protection of the child, close quote. So he's advocating this theory from the time of earliest detection, isn't he?
Right. As soon as a child who's been abused is identified and treated, and even to the point of supporting them in the case, goes to court. That it would be important to provide a sense of belief, of acceptance, and support and protection of that child.
So he's advocating believe the child, isn't he?
He is advocating the belief that they are sexually abused.
He's advocating believe the child.
Right? And I think what I said earlier, we're starting from the assumption that this describes what happens with a child who has been abused. He's advocating that we should support the child's assertions or statements or disclosures.
Well, the next quote. Quote, unless there's a special support for the child and immediate intervention to force responsibility on the father, the girl will follow the normal course and retract her complaint. The girl admits she made up the story, close quote. That's a direct quote, isn't it?
Yes?
So he's basically saying that when they retract the story, the retraction's false.
With a child who has been sexually abused, yes.
Let's look at the next quote. Quote, the clinician with an understanding of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome offers the child a right to parity with adults in the struggle for credibility and advocacy. Isn't that correct? That's a direct quote.
That's correct.
So he's encouraging people to be advocates on credibility, correct?
And again, assuming that the child has been abused, which is what accommodation syndrome is about, then he is advocating or for their credibility, that people believe that they have been abused and advocate for them.
So he's advocating using this, a courtroom, to advocate for credibility.
I think you could use it. If your perception is the accommodation syndrome should be used to make a determination about whether the child is abused or not, which I previously said I don't agree with, then I think that issue of credibility would have one interpretation. That is, we're looking to see if they're credible, if they're telling the truth or not telling the truth. But here we're talking about the fact that we've assumed the child's been abused. Child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is all about what has happened with a child who's been abused. In that case, we're providing support or credibility for the child in their disclosure.
I want to go to the last quote. Quote, "It has become a maximum among child sexual abuse intervention counselors and investigators that children never fabricate the kind of explicit sexual manipulations they divulge in complaints and interrogations." That's a quote from the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome in 1983, isn't it?
Right? That's a quote from the Child Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. That was taken from Elmer Dean Muldoon, an article in 1979. Incest Confronting the Silent Crime, Minnesota Program for Victims of Sexual Assault.
He incorporated it into his article?
That's correct.
Near the conclusion section, correct?
It is in the second to the last page of the text.
Isn't it true that the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome is an advocacy model?
I would agree with that. It advocates for some characteristics with children who have been sexually abused.
Have you taught CPS workers?
I have, yes.
CPS workers do investigations for court, correct?
That's correct.
Have you talked to them about Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome?
I've talked about child abuse and talked about accommodation syndrome as a part of that, and some of the characteristics of accommodation syndrome as a part of that.
Secrecy, was that the first of the 5 categories that Roland Summit talked about, correct?
That's correct.
Now, if a child fabricates an allegation of molestation, they can say that it occurred right now. It's happening right now. He's touching me at this moment. Or it happened sometime in the past, correct? Those are the only 2 choices.
That's correct.
And if they say it happened right now, the witness would be able to look and see if it's correct, right?
Sure.
So if they say it happened a month ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, that would give the appearance that they had kept it a secret for 6 months or a year, wouldn't it?
It would give that appearance.
And Dr. Roland Summit never talked about that in the article, did he?
Dr. Summit did not talk about false allegations in his article.
Now, an investigator might ask a child in a suggestive way, "Did he tell you to keep a secret?" That can happen, can't it?
It could happen, yes.
Does Roland Summit talk about how that questioning might be an explanation for secrecy?
Again, that issue of suggestibility or that the allegations was false was not a part of Dr. Summit's focus or intent in talking about the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome.
Well, let's talk about helplessness.
Yes?
You talked about how children being molested are helpless, right?
Helpless, vulnerable, relatively powerless.
Isn't it true that all children are helpless, whether or not they've ever been molested?
That characteristic is consistent with many children who are younger or smaller or in some ways less powerful than others.
He also talked about entrapment, correct?
Yes?
And he talks about how children accommodate to abuse due to an imbalance of power. Would that be fair to say?
Generally because of the circumstances that they're in.
Can children also accommodate an adult who wants to falsely accuse someone? Can't they?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, domestic cases, husband and wife fighting over custody, can a parent have an influence on a child's statement?
Certainly, a parent could have an influence on a child's statement.
And if the child went along with a false accusation, that would be accommodating that parent, right?
I think you could use the word accommodating, but I think he is being quite unique in talking about accommodating as related to symptoms or mental health problems or sources of coping that a child who's been sexually abused would engage as a result of their abusive experience.
Well, being raised in a family that has an alcoholic in it, would children accommodate that?
There would be some element of learning how to cope with an experience or modify the way in which you live your life or think or feel if you came from a family where one or both parents were alcoholics.
And the same is true if you came from a family where there was violence, isn't it?
I think there's an element of learning how to cope or adapt to violence. If you have somebody who's just a violent person, if there's an issue of domestic violence, kids learn to make adaptations or changes in the style in which they think or feel based upon a lot of different types of dominant themes, particularly aggressive ones.
And Roland Summit never talked about, in a false allegation cases, how children might accommodate, did he?
No, he didn't. Dr. Summit's article was not about false allegations. It was quite simply about what commonly occurs with a child who's been sexually abused.
Well, number 4, delayed, conflicted, and unconvincing disclosure. That was one of his 4 areas, wasn't it?
That was the 4th?
He talked about children can delay because they're embarrassed, right?
That could be one reason, yes.
A delay can also be because it's a false allegation case. They point to a time in the past, and it happened 6 months ago, a year ago, giving the appearance of a delay even though there wasn't.
An appearance of a delay, I would argue, isn't applicable to the accommodation syndrome. The accommodation syndrome is about children who've been sexually abused. So you can't have a delay in disclosure about being sexually abused if you haven't been sexually abused.
It would give the appearance of one, though, wouldn't it?
If you made a false allegation about something that happened in the past, you could have that.
Well, someone also talks about incredible stories. Isn't it true that incredible stories can be the result of false allegations?
It is possible that if you were going to make up a story, you're going to have a false allegation of abuse. It is quite possible that that story could be incredible.
Did Roland Summit write about how an incredible story could be caused by a false allegation?
Dr. Summit wrote an article about what commonly occurs in children that have been sexually abused. It was not his intention to write about false allegations.
It was a single hypothesis article, wasn't it?
He wasn't using it to make a determination about whether the child was abused or not. He wasn't using it with regard to a hypothesis. Actually, I think his 1990 article goes specifically to that point, and when he uses the term pattern, he's not making a determination about whether the child is abused. He's describing the pattern of behavior that sexually abused children exhibit.
And those patterns can exist in false allegation cases also, right?
Well, I would argue and perhaps agree with you to some degree. There are certain characteristics that are consistent with kids that have not been abused, but I would disagree with the basic position of that question, because the accommodation syndrome is used to provide a description of a child who's been sexually abused. So if they've not been sexually abused, then there's no issue of secrecy. What would secrecy be about if you have not been sexually abused? What would you delay in disclosing about if there was no abuse to have a disclosure about? I mean, the question you're asking me sort of leads to the issue of using accommodation syndrome as a means to make a determination whether somebody is abused or not.
Well, he indicated under the section called delay, conflicted, and unconvincing that the inconsistencies may be caused by the trauma of the abuse, right?
That would be one of the reasons, yes.
But he never talked about how inconsistencies can be caused by allegations being false.
Dr. Summit's article was not about false allegations. It was about describing what commonly happened with a child who was abused.
And the 5th section was called retraction, correct?
Correct?
He wrote about children can retract stories of abuse to preserve the family.
That would be one of the reasons.
Isn't it also true that a retraction can be true? In other words, they retract a false allegation.
That could be the case, but that wouldn't be consistent with the accommodation syndrome. It is possible that a child can make an allegation that is not true and retract that allegation, which would then be true. That could be the case, but that wouldn't be an applicable part of the accommodation syndrome because, again, we're dealing with the assumption that the child has been abused.
Roland Summit came out with an article years later saying child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome was being misused, right?
Correct.
Do you see any danger in teaching, whether it's a jury or the police or CPS workers, child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, without at the same time teaching them the flip side having to do with false allegations?
Well, my understanding of what child abuse accommodation syndrome is, as presented by Dr. Summit, has been fairly well supported. I don't see a danger of presenting to any group, whether it's law enforcement, social workers, teachers, members of a jury. What research has to say about what happened with kids who've been sexually abused, it's my opinion that people in the community, their perception of what sexual abuse is and how kids respond is usually taken from newspaper accounts, magazines, sort of sensationalistic television stories, not what research has to say. And so I don't see the danger of providing information about what research has to show about sexual abuse.
You don't see a danger of not seeing both sides of the story?
To the best of my knowledge, that we have, with regard to what research has to say, I don't know that there's a different side of the story. I'm presenting to you what research has to say about child sexual abuse, the effects of child sexual abuse. If there's another side of the story, then I don't know what that is. I don't know quite what would be the example. If the other side of the story would be most children are sexually abused by strangers, I think it would be dangerous if you had somebody come and say most children are sexually abused by strangers, because that's not what the research shows. It shows somebody they have an acquaintance with. That's what I said, and that's what the research supports.
Nowhere in the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, which uses the word advocacy over and over and over again, does it discuss issues of false allegations, correct?
That's correct, and that was not Dr. Summit's intention, and that wasn't the focus of the article.
I have no further questions. What has been accomplished during the cross-examination of the prosecution expert? First, the prosecution expert has been forced in front of the jury to discuss false allegations. Second, in every case that I have used this method, the prosecution expert has repeatedly had to explain to me over and over and over that Dr. Summit was not concerned with false allegations. Child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome was not concerned with false allegations. Child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome did not discuss that each element of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome can also appear in false allegation cases, because Summit was not concerned with false allegation cases. Every time I have done this, the prosecution expert gets upset with me. And then he keeps having to repeat over and over that Dr. Summit didn't address false allegations. Now, look at the impact of that testimony. Compare its impact with the impact of the jury instruction. California Jury Instruction 10.64, which states, evidence has been presented to you concerning child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. This evidence is not received and must not be considered by you as proof that the alleged victim's molestation claim is true. Child sexual abuse accommodation research is based upon an approach that is completely different from that which you must take in this case. The syndrome research begins with the assumption that a molestation has occurred and seeks to describe and explain common reactions of children to that experience. As distinguished from that research approach, you are to presume the defendant innocent. The people have the burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You should consider the evidence concerning the syndrome and its effect only for the limited purpose of showing, if it does, that the alleged victim's reaction, as demonstrated by the evidence, are not inconsistent with her having been molested. The jury will now understand that instruction when it is read at the end of the trial.
But the jurors have learned a lot more. Third, the jurors have learned about causism, hyperclaiming, incidence versus prevalence, validity, and reliability without the scientific terms even being used. They have learned on a common sense level what all jurors can understand. They have learned on a visual level rather than with scientific jargon. With this method, the jurors learn why child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is dangerous. They are learning that child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a totally one-sided model. Later we will teach them about confirmatory bias. They will form their own ideas that the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a confirmatory bias model. To quote an old saying, all roads lead to Rome. Fourth, the prosecution expert witness has been forced to agree to all or most of the elements that the defense expert will address in his or her direct exam. This enhances the credibility of the defense expert. Fifth, the advocacy quotes that were shown on the display boards have exposed the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome for what it is, a non-scientific advocacy model that is not designed to search for the truth.
Now let's see how all these parts are put together. In the next courtroom reenactment, Dr. Rondos is going to play the part of the defense expert witness. He was not the expert in the case that we are using as the model for this skit, and the questions and answers are not his. In fact, they are from the same trial that the questions and answers of Dr. Urqueza were taken. I am certain that Dr. Rondos would have handled the testimony with a more scientific presentation. However, there are few qualified experts on junk science available to testify in your cases. We want you to see what the testimony would appear like using a local expert. Again, we have edited out many of the ums and ahs and non-essential parts. I want to call Dr. Local.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
All right, go ahead.
Dr. Local, what kind of doctor are you?
I'm a forensic psychologist.
And can you tell us briefly what your educational history is? I'm referring to schooling.
Yes, I received a bachelor's degree, California State University of Los Angeles,
In what?
in psychology and sociology. It was 1969. In 1971, I earned a master's degree in social work from the University of California at Berkeley. And in 1987, I earned my doctorate degree in psychology from the University of San Francisco.
Can you give us a brief overview of your work history?
Primarily, I devoted my entire career to a variety of services for children and families.
Are you in private practice at this time?
Yes.
Before going into private practice, did you work for some organizations?
Yes.
Can you tell us what those were?
I work for the Santa Clara County Department of Mental Health. I work for the Marin County Community Mental Health Child and Adolescent Outpatient Services. I've been in private practice all along, and I've worked for county agencies part-time.
Okay. Were you ever a court evaluator?
Yes, I've been appointed as a court evaluator for conducting custody evaluations, for performing as a special master, etc.
As part of that work, are you involved in doing evaluations in custody cases where allegations of abuse have been made?
Yes.
How many years have you been working in the mental health field?
Since my master's degree in Berkeley in 1971, so my first license was in 1973. So over 30 years.
Have you done research?
I have conducted research, yes.
So do you understand the principles of scientific research?
Yes.
Have you worked for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children?
Yes.
What kind of work do you do for them?
I get called in by them to conduct interviews and interventions with recovered or abducted children, and called to do the family reunification intervention when these kids are picked up.
Are you on the Board of Commissioners for the oral examination of psychology in the state of California?
Yes, I was until they stopped the oral boards for licensure.
In the field of forensic psychology, have you dealt with issues of child abuse?
Yes.
How many years have you worked in that field?
I've been involved in working in child abuse really my entire career.
Is the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome a subset within the field of child abuse?
It's part of the knowledge base having to do with child sexual abuse.
So if you wanted to talk to people who know about child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, you would talk to people who are in the field of child sexual abuse?
Yes.
Have you worked your entire career in the area of child sexual abuse?
Yes.
Now, when did you first learn, or where were you when you first encountered the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
I was working for Marin County Community Mental Health Child and Adolescent Outpatient Services in the early 1980s.
Have you followed the literature of having to do with the critiquing of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes, I have.
Have you read any of the empirical research having to do with child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes, I have.
Have you testified before concerning child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes.
I would move that Dr. Local be accepted as an expert in forensic psychology and the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, Your Honor.
He is accepted as an expert in forensic psychology and the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome.
Thank you. What is your opinion about the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
That is a dangerous theory because it has powerful suggestibility attributes. It uses a confirmatory bias model.
Can you explain for us what a confirmatory bias model is?
Yes. Confirmatory bias is the hallmark behavior of interviewer bias, and it's basically a one-sided model. It's based on one-sided assumptions.
Has the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome been rejected by the scientific community?
Yes, it has.
Who within the scientific community has rejected it?
It's been rejected by the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the American Psychological Society, a host of 40 or 50 prominent researchers in the field, Cece, Brooke, Poole, Lamb, and many more.
Are those some of the top researchers in the field of psychology in the nation?
Yes, they are.
Has some research come out from Dr. Stephen Cece on this issue?
Recently, yes, Dr. Cece at Cornell University just published a piece of research looking at the accommodation syndrome assumptions.
Now, who is Dr. Stephen Cece?
Stephen Cece is a leading researcher in the Department of Psychology at Cornell. He's internationally renowned for his work and his research in the field of suggestibility and memory and child abuse.
Does the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome teach one set of definitions to be applied to a number of symptoms or events?
Yes, it does.
Is there any danger in teaching one set of definitions when there are more than one set of definitions?
Yes, indeed.
Have you come up with a humorous example of the dangers of only knowing one definition?
Yes, I have an example.
Can you please give it to us?
Sure. If we have two college students sitting across from one another at a library, one is a girl and the other is a boy. The girl is from England and the boy is from America. And the girl asks the boy for a rubber, and the college boy gets embarrassed and is about to get himself in a whole lot of trouble because he doesn't realize that in England, a rubber is an eraser.
So you can get in trouble if you only know one definition to a word that has more than one definition?
Yes.
Have you developed a set of charts that demonstrates that the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a confirmatory bias model?
Yes.
Now, are those charts that you developed to explain what a confirmatory bias model is?
Well, it's an assumption that children are told to keep secret that the child has been molested, and that the secrets has some significance as an indicator of abuse.
Okay, is this representing Dr. Roland Summit's theory, this element of secrecy?
Yes.
And is the arrow pointing towards molestation the representation of one point of view or one side?
Yes. The assumption having to do with molestation is one-sided.
Now, is the title changed to forensic factors? What does the word forensic mean?
Well, the title changes to forensic factors because forensic refers to the legal arena and it refers to a scientific methodology, a manner of investigating using hypothesis testing, looking for alternative explanations, and so on.
In forensic work, are there alternative hypotheses such as a molestation did occur and another hypothesis that a molestation did not occur?
Yes, that's correct.
Is this what the representation of the arrow pointing to the left is referring to?
Yes, it's referring to alternative possibilities, examples, and considerations.
In your example, have you found different things that could point to the other side of the equation?
Yes.
Can you point out a couple of them to us and explain what you mean?
Well, if it's a false allegation, if it didn't happen, then it's not a secret. The idea of secrecy involves a time interval between an event and a report of an event.
How about number 4 on your chart?
The idea of secrecy may not even apply. Children can get exposed to the idea of secrecy in a suggestive interview.
Is this chart you made a complete list of all of the possibilities?
No. There are just a few of the very real possibilities and alternative hypotheses.
Let's take a look at helplessness next. Is this a part of Roland Summit's theory, a representation, a graphic representation?
Yes.
And on the notation to the right, pointing in the direction of molestation, are these some of the ideas that Dr. Summit put forward in the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome?
Yes.
Can you briefly go over what those are?
Yes. Children are helpless. Children cannot resist adults. They're more vulnerable to molestation, to being manipulated. Summit's assumption was that children can't resist adult sexual advances. It's considered a myth now, but one idea was that children think that adults will not believe them, and the position of Dr. Summit in the accommodation model is to teach other professionals to advocate for children or to help make others believe the child.
Now, what you're showing us, is this more of a forensic model or a scientific model?
On this side of the chart, we have the forensic model or the scientific model, yes.
Can you explain what's on the left-hand side pointing towards no molest?
An alternative assumption is helplessness is common in all children. That just because a child is helpless doesn't mean that they were abused and that children have an expectation of assistance from authority.
Why is this a forensic model?
A forensic model is designed to find the truth without bias, to use multiple evaluation techniques.
Well, let's go to the next chart.
Okay.
Does this notation of entrapment all represent the theory of Roland Summit?
Yes. It comes directly from Summit's idea of a child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, that children accommodate abuse due to the power imbalance between children and adults.
Is this a one-sided view or confirmatory bias model?
Yes, because the problem with the assumption is it's not something that you can observe or can be measured.
Now, looking at what you've done, does this now represent a forensic model or a balanced model?
Yes.
You don't have to go over all of them, but just pick out one or two of them on the forensic side for demonstration purposes.
Okay. That children tend to accommodate an interviewer's bias. In an interview by anybody, policeman, parents, teacher, children will accommodate a bias. And that interviewer bias will have a powerful effect on children's statements. Children naturally seek to preserve relationships. Children want to please adults, and children are sensitive to the agenda of an interviewer.
Could you put up your next board, please? Is this a visual depiction of the child sexual abuse accommodation element referred to as delayed and conflicted and unconvincing reporting?
Yes. These are reasons for, or ideas, or assumptions about why the report of a child might be delayed. The accommodation syndrome model suggests that delay is caused by a child being embarrassed to tell, that children do not report abuse to preserve and protect the family unit, that denial is caused by a child's inner reluctance to tell. The assumption here is also that all allegations are true, so there are delayed reports, conflicted, unconvincing, inconsistent reports, It is false.
Can an incredible, non-believable allegation be because they're not real?
Because they're not real, yes. Remember, if it's not credible, it's not credible. If it's not credible, it might not be real. That would appear to be the most logical explanation.
The last element is retraction. Could you put up the board on retraction?
Sure. Yes. His idea was that all children's reports are true, and that children do not lie, and that if children retract, then that retraction is an indication of abuse.
Do the accommodation model folks advocate preventing a retraction?
Yes, they advocate preventing retraction. They advocate isolating children from people who may not believe that abuse has occurred.
Can you show us the forensic model? Can you explain the first element pointing to no abuse?
An alternative explanation for retraction is that a retraction could be true. There may never have been a molestation. Adults should listen to and evaluate retractions. Basically, adults should be looking for the truth and considering all alternative explanations.
Considering all 5 of these boards up here, a forensic model doesn't tell you to ignore what Roland Summit has said, does it?
No. However, you need to have a balanced, unbiased method of looking at these factors, which Dr. Summit failed to do in his work or his article.
I have just a few more questions. Has the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry come out with a policy statement concerning whether or not to use a confirmatory bias model as a forensic model?
Yes. They came out with a policy statement suggesting that it is important to always consider the possibility of false allegations. They stated that multiple evaluation techniques should be used and not to rely merely on the child's account.
Has the California State Department of Social Services, the people in charge of protecting children, come out with a policy statement on whether to use forensic or a confirmatory bias model?
Yes. They do state that it's very important to always consider the possibility of a false allegation. Also, that they found that false allegations occur among children and adolescents who make very, very convincing reports out of boredom, to gain attention, or vindictiveness, or to cover up their own sexual acting out. Also, that false allegations occur in the context of divorcing families at a higher rate than the general population.
Does the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome violate the scientific standards of specificity and sensitivity?
Yes.
Can you explain what that means?
Yes. Diagnostic sensitivity and diagnostic specificity are basic standards of behavioral science that need to be met. Sensitivity in this context means that the method detects all or most all of the acts of molestation. Diagnostic specificity refers to the same assessment, the same instrument, to be able to accurately characterize those children that have not been abused as not having been abused.
Well, let me ask you this. Is it the more sensitive test, the test that is more likely to not miss anyone?
Yes, the highly sensitive test will diagnose everyone as having the disorder.
Using the sensitivity of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, what percentage of the children in the United States would be considered as having been molested?
Well, all the children in the world would be found to have been molested using the child sexual abuse accommodation model. It has no ability to detect those that have not been molested. That is what is referred to as specificity.
Did Roland Summit come out with another article about the misuse of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes, he did. In 1992, he published an article about this. In 1992, he explained that he didn't intend for the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome to be used forensically. He meant it to be used only clinically.
Are there any empirical studies supporting the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
No, there are none.
Are there any empirical studies which have studied the dangers of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes, there have been a number of them.
Do you understand that at the end of the trial, the jury will be read a jury instruction that tells the jurors that they are not to use the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome for purposes of determining whether a molest occurred or did not occur?
Yes, I understand.
Have there been studies of what effect that information has on the fact-finding body even if they've been warned not to use the information to determine if molestation occurred.
Yes, there's a piece of research.
What is that research?
Well, the authors, Covera, Penrod, Bordetta, and Levy, and the research involved using a child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome testimony on research subjects and measuring the effects. The effects were that the subjects made wrong decisions because of exposure to this confirmatory bias model. In other words, their accuracy rate for determining the truth went down rather than up.
Were the subjects told not to use it in making their determination of whether the molestation occurred
Yes,
or
that's
not occur?
Yes, that's correct, and they used it anyway.
Is that the problem with teaching one definition to a symptom or event?
Yes.
Is the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome an advocacy model?
Yes, it's considered an advocacy model.
I'm not going to go through each element because the jury has already seen them. But did you prepare a set of charts which uses quotes directly from the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome to demonstrate that it was an advocacy model?
Yes, these were the quotes that I prepared for you to use. Acceptance and validation are crucial to the psychological survival of the victim. Page 179. The verdict, the validation of the child's perception of reality, acceptance by adult caretakers, and even the emotional survival of the child may all depend on the knowledge and skill of the clinical advocate. Page 179. Clinical experience and expert testimony can provide advocacy for the child. Page 183. They need an adult clinical advocate to translate the child's world into an adult acceptable language. Page 183. Without a consistent therapeutic affirmation of innocence, the victim tends to become filled with self-condemnation and self-hate for somehow inviting and allowing the sexual assault. Page 183. As an advocate for the child, both in therapy and in court, it is necessary to recognize that no matter what the circumstances, the child had no choice but to submit quietly and to keep the secret. Page 183. The more illogical and incredible the initiation might seem to adults, the more likely it is that the child's plaintive description is valid. Page 183. Unless there is expert advocacy for the child in the criminal court, the child is likely to be abandoned and as the helpless custodian of a self-incriminating secret which no responsible adult can believe. Page 188. The psychiatrist or other counseling specialist has a crucial role in the early detection, treatment, intervention, and expert courtroom advocacy. The specialist must help mobilize skeptical caretakers into a position of belief, acceptance, support, and protection of children. Page 188. Unless there is special support for the child and immediate intervention to force responsibility on the father, the girl will follow the normal course and retract her complaint. The girl admits she made up the story. Page 188. The clinician, with an understanding of the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome, offers the child a right of parity with adults in the struggle for credibility and advocacy. Page 191. It has become a maxim among child sexual abuse intervention counselors and investigators that children never fabricate the kinds of explicit sexual manipulations they divulge in complaints or interrogations. Page 190-191.
Do these quotes expose the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome as being an advocacy model or a confirmatory bias model?
Advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. Advocacy, 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 advocacy. It is clearly a confirmatory bias model.
What is the first recorded case in which a confirmatory bias model was used?
The first recorded case in American law was the Salem witch trials in which children testified.
In that model, were all symptoms that anyone exhibited found to be symptoms of being a witch?
Yes.
Were there any symptoms found not to be symptoms of being a witch?
I don't believe so.
Was the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome model used in the McMartin preschool case?
Yes, it was.
And did Roland Summit train the individuals who did the interviews and the investigation in the McMartin case?
Yes, he trained them, and he also was involved in that case.
Why don't you explain what the McMartin case was?
The McMartin preschool case involved a situation where a mentally disturbed mother of a 2.5-year-old child claimed that her child had been molested. In the process of the investigation of this child, the district attorney's office informed the police department that they really needed to have more evidence. So letters went out to more than 200 parents or families saying that a molestation event may have occurred at the McMartin preschool and, quote, your child may have been molested. They named some of the possible kind of molestation events. In a short period of time, 360 children came forward to claim that they had been molested. It turned out to be hysteria. None of the allegations were ever shown to be true.
Did Key McFarland do the interview in those cases with those children?
Yes.
Was Key McFarland a student of Dr. Roland Summit, the author of the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome?
Yes.
Does the empirical research show that being exposed to the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome decreases the trainee's ability to make reliable evaluations?
Yes, because it's a confirmatory bias-based model.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions. In this seminar, we are trying to handle a very complex presentation. We would like to have a skit on how the prosecution would cross-examine the experts for the defense, but there's not enough time. Instead, we will summarize the various attacks. Because we have now successfully won the war on the scientific battlefront, the prosecution cannot prove that child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is scientifically sound. They will not even try. They will resort to the same line of questioning as before. So, doctor, you agree that children have been molested will retract their statements? So, doctor, you agree that children who have been molested will delay reporting? So, doctor, you agree that children who have been molested will have inconsistent statements? Your expert's response will be, yes, that happens in both true and false allegations of child molest. Since that form of attack does not work, they will resort to the standards. Isn't it true that you usually testify for the defense? Isn't it true, doctor, that you're being paid? Isn't it true, doctor, that unlike Dr. Urquiza, you haven't been published by APSAC? Isn't it true, doctor, that you haven't treated as many children for molestation as Dr. Urquiza? Isn't it true that you previously testified to, followed some quote taken completely out of context from prior testimony? Isn't it true, etc., etc., etc.? Let me tell you, the final hiding place for those whose position is scientifically bankrupt is to slime the expert for the defense. Isn't it true, doctor, that Hustler magazine wrote an article about you? Isn't it true that you were not qualified to testify one time? They leave out that it was one time out of 200 times, and the judge was a former district attorney. Isn't it true that a porno magazine called you the expert for the defense? Isn't it true, doctor, that you were the expert witness for Ted Bundy, Hitler, and Attila the Hun? Isn't it true that 25 years ago your spouse called 911 on you? More time was spent investigating my expert than was spent investigating the case. Isn't it true that you teach defense attorneys how to get child molesters off? Isn't it true that you're not a child advocate? Isn't it true that, etc., etc., etc.? Since the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is scientifically bankrupt, this is where the DA goes every time. The California District Attorneys Association keeps files on defense expert witnesses. If your expert has testified in the past, he or she will know what type of slime questions they will be asked. Make sure to debrief your expert on earlier slime attacks so that you can be ready. Make appropriate motions in limine. and diffuse any remaining slime issues by addressing those issues with your expert witness in front of the jury first. My last thought on this issue is whether to counter-slime the prosecution expert. I have been sorely tempted in the past, but I think that the better method is to take them on in a scientific manner. What do they say? If you wrestle in the mud, you're going to get muddy.
Well, now that you've seen our visual method, what do you think? Here's what we were trying to accomplish. First and foremost, we want the jurors to understand that the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is a confirmatory bias model and junk science. We want them to see that it is an all roads lead to Rome model. Not only does it not help in the search for the truth, it gets in the way of determining the truth. We want them to see the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome as a dangerous model which in the courtroom setting only misleads juries. I think we've accomplished that. Now let's hit them over the head with it. During closing argument, you might say to the jury, if you had a son, a brother, a father, a husband, or a loved one that was falsely accused of child molestation, would you want someone trained in the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome conducting that investigation, or would you want someone that is trained as an evaluator? You must emphasize that their job is to search for the truth.
Now that the jury clearly understands what a confirmatory bias model is and why it is dangerous, during closing argument you need to expand on that understanding and show that the prosecutor's entire case was built on a confirmatory bias model. What else in the case was done on a confirmatory bias model? Start with the CPS interview of the child. They were not concerned with asking questions that would expose that the allegations were false. They just kept asking for more and more and more incidents of molestation. Did he do anything else? How many times? How many weeks? Where did he touch you? Anywhere else? Next, look at whether the police interview was a confirmatory bias interview. The jury has now seen what a confirmatory bias model is and that it is dangerous. It is not a search for the truth. Next, you look at the medical testimony and the use of unscientific terms, consistent with. Each stage of the prosecution's case must now be examined to see if it was truly a confirmatory bias model. If it was, the jury now knows the dangers of such a model. Use the term one-sided interchangeably with confirmatory bias models. Jurors don't like to have been tricked or manipulated. You might want to point out how they all picked up their pencils and took notes when they heard the term child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. You might want to point out how they were being manipulated and misled. I would close out this area of your closing with the following type of statement. If you had a son, a brother, a father, a husband, or a loved one that was falsely accused of child molestation, would you want someone trained in child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome conducting the investigation, or would you want someone that is trained as an evaluator? You must emphasize that their job is to search for the truth. They are not advocates.
We have developed more resources to assist you in defending against junk science and false allegations of sexual molestation. In the area of junk science, I recommend that you look at the resources on the psychlaw.net website at www.psychlaw.net. Earlier, we said we would show you where you can get our motions on excluding junk science claims that only a small percentage of allegations of sexual molestation are false. We have a short clip to show you where to get this motion and other motions concerning cases involving child molestation allegations.
I would now like to show you where you can go to get all of the necessary things to put together a presentation to counter child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. We have grouped everything that you need together on one of our websites. It is called www.kmsf.org. californiamotions.com. That's California Motions without any spaces or dashes. californiamotions.com. You log in, and this is the screen that you will see. Again, we've grouped everything together to make it easy. Go to a category, click on that, and select Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome. And here's what you will find. Let me quickly go over it. The first one is the actual Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome article. It is a PDF file. The second are the display boards, which we use to show what I call crazy quotations from Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome that's used in the presentation. The next one is the same quotation board, but this time it's in publisher language rather than a PDF. The next entry is the display boards used to give the presentation showing the symptomology. This one is in PDF language. We also that's letter size so that you can have it on your desk while you're questioning their expert. And here is the large size, the 24-inch by 30-inch size in PDF. Of course, PDF cannot be edited. And here is the program that you really need, and that is Microsoft Publisher. This is the display board in Microsoft Publisher, and we have a copy of it in WordPerfect for you. Normally, all of our transcripts are kept on our website, prosecutionwitnesstranscripts.com. That's with no spaces, no dashes, prosecutionwitnesstranscripts.com. But for ease, since we used Dr. Urqueza's testimony for the prosecution, we have placed a copy of the transcript from the trial from which that testimony came here. Then it's followed by the motions. We have a motion to exclude junk science studies on the percentage of false allegations in PDF format. We also have it in WordPerfect format and in Word format. And then the second motion, which you should file anytime there is going to be an issue of the introduction of Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, is a motion which we have entitled Excluding Subterfuges Around Bledsoe. That's done in PDF format, WordPerfect, and Word. For your information, in order to obtain one of these on your computer, all you have to do is click on it. File download will open and you hit save. You are now looking at your own computer, so you can place it in your documents or wherever you would like. This represents your own computer. Hit save, and you have now downloaded the document directly from our website onto your computer. All these materials combined are necessary to mount a defense against the introduction of Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome.
If you log on and have problems, please don't call us. Send an email to the tech support listed on the page. Now let's take a moment and show you a resource that we have developed to share transcripts of prosecution experts in cases involving allegations of molestation. If you want a copy of the transcript of Dr. Urqueza that we used in this skit, this is how you can get it.
The next thing I would like to show you is a website we've developed called prosecutionwitnesstranscripts.com. prosecutionwitnesstranscripts.com. And let me log in. You can see over here you can obtain your own password to log in. And this is so that defense attorneys can share transcripts of expert witnesses. Now, if you have a transcript you want to share and you have it in some digital format, It could be Word, WordPerfect, PDF, or anything else. You click this button to upload your transcript. A menu will open and allow you to click on your file and upload it onto our website. It first goes to us for approval and for virus checking. Let's take a look at a few of them that we have. This is a drop down of some of the names that we have in so far. And let's take a look at this. Here's one that I know. Anthony Urqueza from the UC Davis testifies on child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Let's say you want to get prepared for cross-examination for him. Here is a transcript that was done on a case, and all you need to do, if you want to save the transcript on your own computer, is hit save, give it a name, place it anywhere you want on your computer, and that's it. Now this project will be useful with the more people who are willing to send in transcripts. If you don't have a scanner and you don't have the transcript in some digital format, you can mail us the paper transcript and we'll be happy to put it up on the website, and you can retrieve it, or your friends can retrieve it as you like. Thanks.
Mr. Clancy and I hope that this presentation will assist you in countering the junk science of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. This is the 4th seminar in our series of 6 seminars on defending against false allegations of sexual molestation. Now, to attack the junk science of the percentage of allegations that are false is not really part of the original 6-part series. Maybe when we're done with the original 6, we'll do one on that issue. If we do, you'll be able to find it on our website where all 6 seminars are available.